When we think about the final century of the Ottoman Empire, it's really easy to just picture this slow, inevitable crumbling. But the real story? Oh, it's so much more dramatic than that. We're talking about a desperate, high-stakes fight for survival, a real race against the clock to drag an ancient empire into the modern world. So let's dive into the incredible story of how one empire's attempt to save itself might have actually sealed its own fate.
To really get the Ottoman dilemma, you have to start right here, with these guys, the Janissaries. Now, they were once the empire's absolute elite fighting force, the tip of the spear. But by the 19th century, they'd become this massive roadblock, the single biggest obstacle to progress, a powerful group that stood against any and all attempts at change.
And that brings us to 1826, and an event with a pretty misleadingly gentle name, the Auspicious Incident. Let me tell you, there was nothing gentle about this. It was a brutal, calculated, and incredibly violent break from the past, one that the Sultan saw as absolutely critical for the empire's survival. So, who were the Janissaries really? Well, they started out as this elite corps created through a system called devshirme. Christian boys, mostly from the Balkans, were levied, converted to Islam, and then trained to be a slave army. And their loyalty? It was supposed to be to the Sultan and the Sultan alone. And for centuries, man, this system worked like a charm.
But by this point, that loyalty was long gone. Completely. Their power had just grown so immense that they basically dominated the government. They were the kingmakers and the kingbreakers. They could start mutinies, they could dictate state policy, and as one sultan, Osman II, found out the hard way in 1622, they could literally imprison and murder any ruler who dared to get in their way.
So in 1826, Sultan Mehmed II decides to set a trap. It's genius, really. He announces he's forming a new European-style army because he absolutely knew, that this was the one thing that would guarantee the Janissaries would revolt. And just like he predicted, they mutinied. They marched on the palace. But this time, the Sultan was ready. His loyal new artillery corps was waiting, and they just unleashed hell on the Janissary barracks.
The result was a total massacre. Over 6,000 Janissaries were killed, and the survivors, they were hunted down, exiled, or executed. The entire corps was just wiped out. It was a shocking, brutal act of state violence, which really makes you wonder, why was something this extreme seen as the only path forward?
Well, to answer that, we've got to zoom out and look at the insane pressure the empire was under. See, the thing is, the Janissaries weren't the real disease. They were just a symptom of an empire that was seriously struggling to keep up with a rapidly changing world. The empire was basically fighting a war on two fronts. From the outside, you've got these newly industrialized European powers and an ever-expanding Russia just carving away at its territory. But from the inside, it was being torn apart by widespread corruption and, maybe even more powerfully, by the rise of ethnic nationalism.
This idea of nationalism, which was imported from the West, was like a poison to a multi-ethnic empire like the Ottomans. For centuries, your identity was based on your religion, not your ethnicity. But now, all of a sudden, Serbs, Greeks, and other groups started demanding their own independent nations. The very fabric of the empire was just unraveling.
So the Ottoman response to this existential threat was one of the most ambitious reform programs you'll find in the 19th century. It was called the Tanzimat, which means reorganization. And it was a complete top-to-bottom attempt to re-engineer the entire state, all in the name of survival.
And the scale of these changes was just immense. With the Janissaries gone, they could finally build a modern army. But to support that army, you need the machinery of a modern state. So boom, suddenly there's a national post office. You've got national ID cards to keep track of citizens, and a telegraph network to send orders instantly across the entire empire.
And the changes went way beyond just the government. They were trying to reshape society itself. By swapping out religious law for secular laws based on the French model and promising legal equality for everyone, Muslim, Christian, Jew, it didn't matter, the Sultan was trying to forge a new unified Ottoman identity to fight back against nationalism. They even abolished slavery and the slave trade in 1847. These were massive changes.
And it didn't stop there. They went after the economy and, maybe most importantly, people's minds. The first paper money shows up in 1840. New universities and schools were set up with a really clear goal: to create a whole new generation of Ottoman leaders and thinkers who could actually navigate this new, modern world.
It was a heroic effort. It really was. A huge, sweeping attempt to catch up with the West. But tragically, it just wasn't enough.
This path to modernization came with a catastrophic price tag, and it led straight to debt, default, and ultimately, defeat.
The whole fatal spiral really begins right here, in 1854. To pay for the Crimean War against Russia, the empire, which had never borrowed from another country before, took its very first foreign loan. And that opened the floodgates.
And the debt just ballooned at this unbelievable rate. Just 20 years later, in 1875, the empire had to default on its loans. It owed European creditors a staggering 224.5 million British pounds.
Now, to put that number into perspective, check this out. The Ottoman Empire's debt was over 10 times its entire annual income. Just for comparison, the U.S. debt-to-income ratio in 2022 was about 7.8. So the Ottoman financial situation, it was just completely unsustainable.
And the consequence of this default was absolutely devastating. It led to the creation of something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was basically an organization run by the Europeans they owed money to, and it gave them direct control over key parts of the Ottoman tax system to make sure they got paid back. It was a humiliating loss of economic control.
Financial collapse was followed almost immediately by military disaster. Weakened by all that debt, the empire suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Russo-Turkish War. Then, the 1878 Congress of Berlin made it all official. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, gone, full independence. A brand new state, Bulgaria, was created. The empire lost huge chunks of its Balkan territory, and other European powers just swooped in to grab even more.
So where does all of this leave us? Well, looking back, it's pretty clear that this century-long struggle for survival left behind a really fascinating and complicated legacy. It's a true paradox of decline.
Because in the end, despite the brutal reforms, the new armies, the modern government, the new laws, the ultimate outcome was this: the empire could not be saved.
But here's a thought. What if we shift our perspective a little? What if saving the empire wasn't the only outcome that actually mattered?
Because here's the wild paradox. The very reforms that were designed to save the Ottoman Empire actually ended up creating the foundations for the nations that would replace it. The modern universities, the secular legal systems, the professional armies, the bureaucracies, all of this groundwork laid by the Tanzimat was essentially inherited by the new nation-states that rose from the ashes, most notably the Republic of Turkey.
And that leaves us with this one final fascinating question. The Ottomans modernized to survive, but in doing that, they created the very tools for their own replacement. So is it possible for a nation to reform itself right out of existence?